So I would very much agree that in this historical terms, the luck is a key to understand the differences in these countries. I would also agree with Jeff that timing, which we really couldn't choose in 1991, 1992, was awfully bad one. I mean, if it would have happened in 1960, it would have been, as you said, probably very, very different policy advice that these economies would have gotten, or these countries and politicians would have gotten. So in that sense, I would also agree with that. And I would here also add that it's not only in terms of ideologies and economic policies that were very particular in the 90s, but 90s was really the time when the ICT really hit the production networks, the global production networks. So you could really outsource, because what does it mean? It means that you can really divide the activities into such small and simple tasks that you can outsource them, because you can create blueprints, you can check that with computers and all that. So this is really what that becomes very apparent in 1990s. And this allows you the outsourcing of activities, allows the footloose production to move into these economies. So what looked in the beginning as a nice sort of IKEA stores and factories, didn't turn out to be that nice. And so that took a lot of time for these economies to understand that even if you privatize and even if you get foreign investors, they are not maybe the kind you need to deliver the structural change or to continue structural change. So I would argue with, or agree with both of these stories, luck and historical circumstances that played. And of course, if you have both, I mean, if you're lucky or unlucky and you have historical circumstances that are very specific, of course you develop certain path dependencies over time that then become almost impossible to change within few years. But I would still argue that the crisis that we just had could have been a critical juncture for these economies. I mean, for Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, you could have really said that, okay, we have experimented with one specific economic model for 20 years almost, which is very much relying on the very stable macroeconomic environment, almost using it as a straitjacket for the government to put over, that you cannot really change policies. Currency board and all that gives you a very sort of stable and very little wiggle room for the government, and also relying very much on foreign investors. And you could have really said that, okay, let's try something new, and let's try it because it's a critical juncture, because we can change it. And it's interesting that none of these countries chose that path, because I think even if you look at Estonia, and I think even if Andrus Ansip would have said, let's now do something very different, I don't think he would have lost anything in terms of political capital, because actually opposite, I think. Even if Estonia would have experimented with, let's say, much stronger industrial policy, all kinds of these things, I think then you could have said in a few years, look, we tried, it doesn't work. So you sort of preempt all the centrist left-wing opposition. But now you have a very strong opposition actually growing or getting stronger and stronger because of that. At least there is partially the danger. Not the danger, but danger in quotation marks. So I think it's an interesting, and this is probably something that we can discuss more, is why none of these countries actually chose a critical juncture to change their economic and fiscal policies. And I think in Estonia, the austerity, which is still the sort of the main fiscal idea, if you will, I think it's useful to divide this into two phases, let's say. First of all, is obviously the response to the crisis, the immediate response to the crisis. And the second one, I would say, is then using austerity for recovery. The immediate response to the crisis, here I think the Latvia and Estonia differ exactly because there was a Parex bank. And in Estonia there was no Parex bank. So we actually, what we did is, we had no domestic banks, so we outsourced all the saving of the banks to the Swedish central bank, and they did a good job. So we can pat them or the backs. And so in that sense, this was a huge difference. But Estonia, of course, faced essentially two choices, I think. One was to escape to the Eurozone, which sort of would have, can be seen as an one obvious choice. And the other one would have been to decouple the krone from the euro, or try some sort of devaluation, deficit spending, or whatever combination of these kind of, let's say, more Keynesian or more heterodox policies, if you will. And I think it would have been almost impossible for Estonia to not choose the euro road. And because I think, well, first of all, Estonia had pretty much cornered itself. There was, we were really, or we had maneuvered ourselves into a corner, but there was no other way out. I mean, as we all know, that many of these loans to the households were denominated in euros, so the valuation would have been difficult, or would have involved some sort of schemes with banks and all that, which is probably thinking about the political culture and all that would have been almost impossible to bring it off. And so I think that the eurozone became a really an exit strategy, both for the government to save their sort of political faces and their political fortunes, actually, and also for the economy and for the, well, also the krone, the currency. I think that this was sort of the only way that we could retain krone for some time was to escape into the eurozone. So I think because of what Jeffrey was actually partially describing in case of Latvia, the path dependencies to the specific kind of economic policy model and fiscal policy model gives you, and especially I would like to stress currency board gives you, because currency board is really the problem with that is not that you have, because we always in Estonia then we looked at, central bank was always saying that, or Eesti Bank as well as saying that we have enough reserves, there is no problem. But as Karsten was actually saying, it's about capital inflows and outflows, so it's about capital accounts and not so much about reserves. And we had massive inflows before the crisis, and after the crisis there was a very massive also outflows, at least partially, or for some time. So you are very much relying or depending on these kind of issues, and you have no almost, as also Karsten was saying, you have almost no mechanism to deal with that once you're in the eurozone or in the European Union, let's say, because capital controls it's very difficult to employ, and actually the only thing you have at your disposal, which again is a very slow-moving policy mechanism, is of course sort of competitiveness, industrial policy, whatever you want to call that, or FDI management. So you manage FDI in a way that it goes into strategic sectors and all that. But this is, of course, something that we should have done in 1992 and not in 2008. So because it doesn't really change much. So I would say that the austerity measures, even if you don't like them ideologically, politically, economically, I mean, it was very difficult that Estonia, almost unimaginable that Estonia would have done something different. And I think once Estonia did that, Latvia and Lithuania sort of had to follow suit. I mean, because, well, I think partially because Estonia is always seen as a bit ahead of the curve as the other Baltic economies. And the other thing is that Estonia became very quickly the sort of European role model, because everybody all of a sudden discovered the Spanish, the Greek, all these problems, and they looked like Estonia, even if they are not Estonian problems. So everybody discovered Estonia as a role model in the future for the European countries. So I think this sort of austerity measures during the crisis was almost inevitable. And it is as I said, it could have been used at a critical juncture, but this would have demanded a very wide social consensus to change the economic policies, to change this and that. Especially both, I think, industrial policies, but also the export-oriented policies, but also the deficit spending. This would have really demanded to change that. And I think there was just no, even the opposition wasn't demanding that. So there was actually nobody demanding that. There were a few very, few people in the newspapers maybe saying, but I mean, who cares about few people in the newspapers? But there was no sort of political constituency for that. And I think this is very different from now, where we are, let's say, in a more or less post-crisis time. And this is the austerity measures that are, let's say that, well, Estonia is not really using austerity measures, but it just tries to get back to the fiscal balance. And not only fiscal balance, but then also to have a surplus in the government budget. I think this, for that, there would be obvious cases to be made that this is not a very smart policy right now. And because it is not so far-fetched to argue then that if you now follow or try to get back into fiscal balance and surplus even, you almost certainly generate another boom-bust cycle, because there is no other sort of vehicle to drive your economic growth than again to rely on capital inflows. and then, capital inflows. Because we don't manage capital inflows, again, they would probably go where the money is easiest to be made, which is, again, probably in real estate or some sort of other sort of asset bubble. So you create this kind of a boom-bust cycle again. And especially if you have an image in Europe already that you're sort of we have almost no government deficit. No, there is slight deficit, but almost no debt and all that. So you have an image that, this is a good place to invest. So I think this is something that makes almost no sense at all now to try to get back into the fiscal surplus. Especially so because I think it was the development fund that did during the crisis the calculations that if Estonia would want to be an export-based growth strategy, or we want to be on export-based growth strategy, we would need to have double the amount of exports than we had at the height of our boom, even actually. We are now back at the exports level of 2007, or even higher than that bit, I think, but just slightly higher. So to get double as that would be in current situation, almost impossible. I think alone the labor force demands would not be there to satisfy that. And so it would be sort of actually a logical way to use the deficit spending for, 5 to 7 years to generate this kind of infrastructure you need and all that to, for instance, in the health sector or wherever you have a huge number of problems, there is investments, need for investment of all these things, and there is at the same time you have 4 million tourists that go through at least Tallinn. So there is you could match some of these and you would generate them, or you would create quite a healthy sort of health tourism sector that would give some of the earnings you would need. So in that sense, I would divide these into two. And I think I wouldn't go into Europe now, I would just stay on Estonia on that. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, let's get back to you, Professor Sommers, and maybe some of these, the fiscal policies and some of their consequences for the nations and for the people perhaps also.
Well, those are just depressing. But I guess we can talk about them. They are important. Well, especially in terms of the impact that they've had on Latvians. I mean, they've just been absolutely devastating in terms of the closure of schools, hospitals, a reduction of social services across the board. Not that there was not a need for some streamlining of services, not that there was not some need for a reorganization of the social sector, but I think it's been an unmitigated disaster. I don't know how you could claim success, at least with Latvia, in terms of its fiscal policy and the impact that it's had on Latvians. Now, if I'm reminded of a graph that the Soviets had, showing their rather exponential growth in terms of their economy across the years with the neoliberals. I mean, they're always claiming that things are just about to get really good. And then, of course, we get another crisis. And it seems as though we're at risk of repeating that pattern in Latvia. I do want to address, though, some of the comments of my colleague on the left, not political left, but on my left here at SD Bank. And I appreciate his good humor and his spirited presentation. And I'm hoping that we have some opportunity to continue our dialogue in the future. But I must take, well, I'll even say umbrage at some of his comments regarding what we just observed.